My parents worshipped my sister. They worshipped her clothes, they worshipped her fake charity events, and they worshipped the ground she walked on. When I revealed my pregnancy, they did not congratulate me. Instead, my mother lunged across the dining table. She struck my pregnant stomach with her closed fist, screaming that the first grandchild must belong to her golden daughter. "Get rid of it!" she shrieked at the top of her lungs. "The first grandchild must be hers. You are stealing your sister's money. Get rid of it." Then someone unexpected arrived. Mom went white and started shaking. It was a moment that shattered our family forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who underestimated your true power. The dining room of my parents' Atlanta mansion was suffocatingly warm, heavy with the scent of roasted turkey, expensive wine, and decades of unspoken resentment. I sat quietly next to my husband DeAndre, watching my family perform their usual holiday theater. My name is Kiara, and for 29 years I was the shadow. I was always the shadow. While my sister Jasmine bathed in the golden light of my parents' adoration, I was the shadow they ignored. Jasmine sat across from me, her flawless makeup masking the ugly truth of her empty life. Next to her sat Bradley, her white husband, who constantly flaunted his supposed old money background while secretly drowning in offshore debt. My parents Yvonne and Calvin hung on to Bradley and Jasmine's every word, desperate to maintain their country club status. They were all waiting for one thing. My late grandfather had left behind a $50 million trust fund. $50 million. 50 million reasons my family had spent the last 3 years pretending everything was perfect. The trust had one ironclad condition. The entire $50 million would be unlocked and handed over to the family of the first great-grandchild. Jasmine and Bradley had been faking infertility struggles for 3 years, milking my parents for endless sympathy and cash to fund their lavish lifestyle while supposedly trying to conceive. I reached into my designer handbag, my fingers brushing against the crisp, glossy sonogram photo. I placed it gently onto the center of the crystal-laden table. The silence that followed was not a pause of joyous surprise. It was a dead, suffocating vacuum. The air was sucked out of the room. Jasmine stared at the black and white image. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble. Then she shrieked. It was a guttural, terrifying sound. She slammed her wineglass down so hard the stem snapped, spilling dark red liquid across the pristine white tablecloth. "That money is mine," Jasmine screamed, her face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. "That trust is mine." Yvonne did not look at the sonogram. She looked at me with a primal, unhinged rage. My own mother stood up, knocking her chair backward. She lunged across the turkey, spread her eyes wild and completely devoid of maternal love. She struck me. My own mother struck me. The hands that were supposed to cradle my child struck me instead. Her fist collided with my lower abdomen, a violent, desperate blow meant to destroy the life growing inside me. "Get rid of it!" Yvonne shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Get rid of it! Get rid of it! The first grandchild must be hers. You are stealing your sister's money." Pain flared sharp and terrifying, but before Yvonne could pull her arm back for a second strike, DeAndre moved. My husband is a senior partner at a top law firm, a man known for his icy composure, but in that moment, he was pure protective fury. DeAndre shoved Yvonne back and instantly tackled Calvin, who had rushed around the table trying to grab my shoulders and hold me down. DeAndre slammed my father into the antique china cabinet. The glass shattered outward, raining down on the dining room floor as Calvin crumpled to the carpet. Bradley stood up, smoothing his expensive sweater, using his white privilege to threaten us with a smug, arrogant sneer. "I am calling the police right now," Bradley warned, pulling out his phone. "My family connections will have you locked up for years for assaulting an old man, DeAndre. You are going to lose your law license today." I did not cry. I did not cower. I stood up straight, shielding my stomach with one hand, and looked Bradley dead in the eyes. "Call them Bradley," I sneered, my voice dangerously calm. Call the police. Let us see who leaves this house in handcuffs. Before Bradley could dial, the grand oak doors of the mansion burst open. It was not the police. Judge Sterling, the formidable executor of my grandfather's estate, marched into the dining room flanked by two massive armed security contractors. Her sharp gaze took in the shattered glass, the spilled wine, and my mother's raised fist. Medical monitoring flagged the heir's heartbeat through the private clinic an hour ago. Judge Sterling announced, her voice slicing through the chaos like a blade. I came to officially congratulate the mother. Instead, I find this. I am locking down the $50 million trust immediately. Every single account is frozen as of this second. And Yvonne, you just assaulted the primary beneficiary of this estate in front of witnesses. Yvonne went ghost white. The color drained from her face as she started shaking uncontrollably, stepping back from the table. The $50 million she had been banking on to fund Jasmine's fake lifestyle was gone, and the trap I had carefully laid was finally springing shut. The sterile scent of the private hospital room was a sharp contrast to the chaotic dining room we had just left. The monitors beeped with a steady, reassuring rhythm. Safe. We were safe. For the first time in 29 years, my child and I were completely safe. The emergency ultrasound confirmed that the baby was unharmed, my heavy winter coat and DeAndre's quick reflexes having absorbed the worst of Yvonne's violent blow. DeAndre sat beside my bed, holding my hand so tightly I could feel his pulse racing against my skin. We are pressing charges, DeAndre stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. I am going to bury them in civil and criminal court. I will take every last dime they have. Before I could answer, the heavy door to the waiting area swung open. Yvonne, Calvin, and Jasmine barged into the room, their demeanor entirely shifted. Gone was the primal rage from the dining room. Now they were performing a theatrical display of victimhood. Jasmine was sobbing loudly, making sure the nursing staff in the hallway could hear her performative grief. Yvonne clutched a tissue to her face, wailing about how worried she was for her sick, unstable daughter. She is just having a pregnancy-induced mental breakdown, Yvonne cried out to a passing nurse, pointing a trembling finger at me. She attacked us at dinner. Her hormones are making her completely delusional. We just want to get her the psychiatric help she desperately needs. The audacity of their lies was breathtaking. They were trying to build a narrative that I was mentally unfit, a calculated move to challenge my competency regarding the trust fund. Calvin slipped past DeAndre, who had immediately stood up to block their path, and cornered me near the hospital bed tray. Calvin reached into his tailored suit jacket and slid a crisp cashier's check onto my lap. It was made out for $100,000. Sign the medical waiver terminating your claim to the trust, Kiara, Calvin whispered harshly, dropping the grieving father act the second the nurses were out of earshot. Take the $100,000 and walk away. Jasmine's foundation will go bankrupt without your grandfather's money. We need that $50 million to keep this family afloat. Do not be selfish. Sign the paper, and we will forget this whole ugly incident ever happened. I looked down at the check. $100,000 to sell out my child's birthright. $100,000 to erase a lifetime of emotional abuse. I picked up the heavy piece of paper. I did not yell. I did not argue. I methodically tore the check in half. Then I tore it into quarters. I tore it until it was nothing but useless confetti, and I dropped the pieces directly into the cup of black coffee Calvin was holding. Get out of my room, I commanded, my voice echoing with a cold, terrifying authority. Bradley pushed his way past Calvin, attempting to intimidate me with his usual arrogant finance bro persona. He leaned over my bed, trying to use his physical size to make me cower. You are making a huge mistake, Kiara. Bradley sneered, his breath reeking of expensive scotch and desperation. You think you are so smart because you play with spreadsheets all day. You do not understand how real wealth works. My investors will tie you up in litigation for the next decade. Take the deal before I ruin you financially. I looked up at Bradley, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He thought I was just a quiet scapegoat who crunched numbers for a living. He did not know I was one of the top forensic accountants in the state, a woman who specialized in hunting down hidden assets and dismantling financial frauds. "You want to talk finance, Brad?" I whispered softly, ensuring only he could hear the poison in my words. "Let us talk about your Cayman Islands shell company, the one you named after your childhood dog. It collapsed 3 weeks ago, did it not?" "I know exactly what you did. I know you have been siphoning millions from Jasmine's fake charity funds to cover your illegal gambling debts. I have every single wire transfer receipt, every offshore routing number, and every fake invoice you generated." Bradley stopped breathing. The smug, superior sneer melted off his face instantly. He went ghost white, his eyes widening in sheer unadulterated panic. He stepped back from my bed, stumbling over his own expensive loafers, as if I had just electrocuted him. How Bradley choked out, his voice cracking. "How do you know about that?" Before I could answer, the silence in the hospital room was shattered by a shrill ringing. Jasmine's diamond-encrusted smartphone was lighting up like a Christmas tree. She snatched it from her purse, her fake tears drying up instantly as she looked at the caller ID. It was her wealth management concierge. "What is it?" Jasmine snapped into the phone, annoyed by the interruption. "I am in the middle of a family crisis." I watched as Jasmine's face morphed from irritation to absolute horror. Her jaw dropped open. "What do you mean my cards are declined?" Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing down the sterile hospital corridor. "What do you mean the accounts are frozen? That is impossible. Try the platinum card. Try the black card. I am Jasmine Adams. You cannot freeze my money." She aggressively tapped her phone screen, logging into her mobile banking app. The bold red numbers on her screen reflected exactly what I already knew. Her balances were zero. The massive lines of credit she relied on to fund her luxurious fake life had been completely revoked. I leaned back against the crisp hospital pillows, pulling the warm blanket over my stomach, and smiled at my older sister. This was not a sudden stroke of bad luck. This was the meticulous, calculated execution of my revenge. I had spent months tracing their fraudulent activities, building a financial trap so tight they would never escape. "This is just the beginning," I said softly, watching my family realize that the quiet, invisible sister they had abused for 29 years was actually the architect of their total destruction. The $50 million trust was safe, my baby was safe, and their fake empire was currently burning to the ground. By the time DeAndre and I pulled into our driveway, my phone was vibrating endlessly with notifications. Jasmine had weaponized her panic over the frozen accounts. She posted a heavily edited, tearful video across all her platforms. I watched my older sister perform the role of a lifetime. Her makeup was artfully smudged to simulate fresh tears. She held a cold compress to her cheek, claiming I had physically assaulted her and our mother in a jealous, unhinged rage. She stared directly into her camera, her voice trembling, telling her followers that I was trying to steal the family inheritance out of pure spite. The video spread like wildfire through Atlanta high society. My sister had built a platform on the illusion of being a perfect philanthropic socialite. Her followers devoured the lie. The comments section was a swamp of venom directed at me. People I had known since childhood left comments calling me a monster, a gold digger, and a disgrace. They demanded that I be arrested and tagged the local police department. Jasmine was spinning a masterpiece of character assassination, leveraging her golden child privilege to destroy my reputation before I could expose her fraud. DeAndre paced our living room, his phone glued to his ear. The viral video had reached the managing partners at his law firm. Optics are everything in corporate law, and the partners were demanding answers about why their newest senior partner was married to a woman trending for alleged elder abuse. DeAndre spoke in low, measured tones, assuring his superiors that the claims were fabricated and legal action was in motion. When he finally hung up, the muscle in his jaw was twitching. He looked at me, expecting to see me crying. Instead, I was sitting calmly at my kitchen island with my laptop open, sipping herbal tea. My screen was filled with forensic accounting software, highlighting a rapid series of desperate wire transfers. I did not care about her Instagram video. I cared about the digital footprints she was leaving all over the city. Every time she panicked, she made a mistake. And right now, she was making the biggest financial mistake of her life. We need to release a statement, DeAndre said, his protective instincts on full display. We need to release the security footage from the hospital. We need to sue her for defamation right this second before this narrative ruins your business. I shook my head and closed my spreadsheet. I am not issuing a single statement. I replied, my voice steady. Let her post her videos. Let her play the victim. Let her climb to the very top of her lie. I looked at my husband, feeling a cold, calculating calm settle over my entire body. The higher she climbs, the harder she falls, and that fall will break every bone in her ego. I turned the laptop screen toward DeAndre so he could see what I was tracking. Jasmine accounts were entirely frozen by Judge Sterling, but she had a massive, highly publicized event scheduled for tonight. Her annual Women of Excellence Charity Gala. It was the crown jewel of her social calendar, an event where she collected massive checks from wealthy donors. Canceling the gala would be social suicide, but hosting a luxury gala required cash that she no longer had. Look at this. I pointed to the glowing red lines on my screen. She just took out 3 massive predatory payday loans under Bradley's name, using their cars as collateral. She borrowed money from shadow lenders at exorbitant interest rates just to pay the caterers and the venue staff for tonight. She is literally mortgaging her freedom to save face for one night. She is terrified, DeAndre. Her empire is built on matchsticks, and she just lit the fuse herself. DeAndre stared at the screen, a slow smile replacing the tension in his face. He understood exactly what I was doing. We were not going to fight her in the mud of social media. We were going to destroy her on her own stage, in front of the very people she was trying to impress. Get dressed, I told him, closing the laptop and standing up. Put on your tuxedo. We are going to a charity gala tonight. 2 hours later, the downtown Atlanta hotel was swarming with local media, wealthy philanthropists, and Atlanta elite. The red carpet was rolled out, flanked by velvet ropes and blinding camera flashes. Jasmine had clearly tipped off the paparazzi, hoping to use the event to further cement her victim narrative and gather sympathy donations. She wanted an audience for her fake tragedy. We were going to give her a show she would never forget. We arrived at the front entrance in a chauffeur-driven Maybach. The heavy car doors opened and I stepped onto the red carpet wearing a stunning custom emerald gown that draped perfectly over my growing stomach. DeAndre looked immaculate beside me, his presence radiating absolute power and unbothered confidence. The paparazzi immediately turned their lenses toward us, the cameras flashing like a lightning storm. Whispers ripped through the crowd as guests recognized the abusive sister showing up at the victim's event. The event coordinator rushed over to intercept us before we could reach the main ballroom doors. "Excuse me," she stammered, physically trying to block our path. "You are not on the guest list. I am going to have to ask you to leave right now." I did not break my stride. I reached into my clutch, pulled out a thick legal contract, and handed it directly to the coordinator. "I am not on the guest list because I am not a guest," I said, my voice echoing over the red carpet. "As of 30 minutes ago, my accounting firm bought out the primary debt holder for this entire event. That makes me the unexpected, uninvited Platinum VIP sponsor for the evening. Now step aside before I fire the entire catering staff." The event coordinator stared at the contract, her mouth opening and closing like a trapped fish. She stepped aside, clutching the paperwork to her chest. DeAndre placed his hand on the small of my back, guiding me through the double doors of the grand ballroom. The room was a spectacular display of stolen wealth. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, illuminating tables draped in gold silk. Atlanta high society was packed into the room, sipping champagne bought with predatory loans. Across the ballroom, my mother, Yvonne, spotted me first. Her champagne flute froze halfway to her lips. She tapped my father, Calvin, frantically on the arm, pointing in our direction. Next to them, Jasmine was working the crowd, wearing a diamond necklace purchased with embezzled funds. When Jasmine saw me gliding toward the VIP tables, her fake pageant smile collapsed into sheer panic. She frantically waved down the head of security, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. The security chief intercepted us just as we reached the front row. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, threatening rumble. The host requested your immediate removal from the premises. Please come with me quietly, or I will use force. DeAndre stepped between me and the security chief. His lethal authority made the guard freeze. Lay one finger on my pregnant wife, and you will spend the next 10 years answering civil assault lawsuits, DeAndre stated. He pressed a copy of the buyout contract against the guard. My firm owns the debt on this venue. She is the highest-ranking sponsor in this building. If you throw her out, the lights go off immediately. Check with the coordinator. If you doubt me. The security chief glanced at the paperwork, then looked at the coordinator who was nodding frantically from the doorway. He took a step back respectfully. My apologies. Please enjoy your evening. Jasmine watched the exchange from the stage. Her face flushed an ugly crimson. Yvonne and Calvin hurried over to shield her from the curious stares of wealthy donors. They could not make a scene. We took our seats at the center. Platinum table pouring sparkling water while my family seethed 10 feet away. The lights dimmed, signaling the start of the main program. Jasmine stepped up to the acrylic podium, gripping the microphone with white knuckles. She was terrified, but she was also a narcissist, incapable of abandoning the spotlight. She forced her eyes to well up with manufactured tears. Thank you all for being here tonight, Jasmine began, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed fragility. This organization means everything to me. As many of you know, my family suffered a terrible betrayal. A collective murmur of sympathy rippled through the ballroom. Wealthy donors leaned in, captivated by the drama. Yvonne dabbed at her eyes, playing the heartbroken mother to perfection. My own sister, Jasmine continued, pointing a shaking finger, attacked my mother and me in a jealous rage. She is trying to destroy our family, but I refuse to let her stop the light we are bringing. Tonight, we are raising funds for women overcoming domestic trauma. Please open your checkbooks. The applause was deafening. Bradley stood up at the family table, clapping loudly, cheering for his brave wife. He looked so smug standing there in his expensive tuxedo, playing the supportive white knight while secretly draining her accounts. Dry. Jasmine gestured to the massive projector screen behind her. We have prepared a short video to show you exactly where your generous donations are going, she announced, stepping away from the podium to let the presentation play. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my smartphone. When my accounting firm bought out the audiovisual debt for the event, my tech team demanded remote access to the servers. I tapped a single button on my screen, overriding the projection booth control panel. The charity music cut out with a harsh static screech. The screen flashed bright white, temporarily blinding the front row. When the image focused, it was not a montage of smiling women receiving help. It was a stark, high-resolution display of Jasmine's primary charity bank account. The audience fell completely silent, confused by the spreadsheets filling the screen. What is this? Jasmine hissed, glaring up at the projection booth. Turn it off. Play the video. Turn it off right now. I stood up from my VIP table. I pulled a small metal pen from my clutch, pressing the button to activate a bright red laser pointer. I aimed the laser directly at the massive screen, circling a specific line item near the top of the ledger. Since my sister is so passionate about transparency, I called out my voice, projecting clearly across the silent ballroom. Let us look at exactly where your generous donations are going. The red laser dot hovered over a wire transfer dated yesterday morning. The amount was clearly visible in bold black numbers. $1.2 million. As you can see, I continued pacing slowly toward the stage. This $1.2 million transfer was not sent to a domestic abuse shelter. It was wired to a holding company in the Cayman Islands registered under the name Bradley Vance. Bradley dropped back into his chair as if he had been shot. The arrogant smirk vanished completely, replaced by pure animal terror. I clicked to the next slide, projecting the offshore routing data. And where did Bradley send your charity money? I asked, the room tracing the laser over the final destination account straight into an illegal offshore gambling syndicate to cover his cryptocurrency debts. Your donations are paying off violent bookies, so my brother-in-law does not get his legs broken." The ballroom erupted. It was not a murmur this time. It was a massive shockwave of pure fury. Chairs scraped violently against the floor as millionaires and local politicians stood up, realizing they had just been implicated in a federal wire fraud scheme. DeAndre placed his hand on the small of my back and guided me smoothly through the chaos. We walked out of the hotel and stepped back into our waiting Maybach. I did not look back. I did not need to. The match was lit, and their fraudulent empire was burning exactly as I planned. The next morning, my parents did not call me to apologize. They never asked how I felt. Instead, Calvin and Yvonne woke up completely consumed by public humiliation and blinding rage. Since Judge Sterling had frozen the $50 million trust and threatened severe legal consequences, if they touched me, they knew they could not attack me directly. So they decided to attack my shield. They targeted my husband. Calvin and Yvonne drove their leased Mercedes straight to the downtown Atlanta high-rise that housed DeAndre corporate law firm. My father marched directly to the front reception desk, slamming his hand down on the marble counter. He demanded an immediate meeting with the managing partner. He name-dropped country club acquaintances and local politicians, completely ignoring the fact that his own reputation was currently bleeding out on social media. Yvonne immediately launched into a heavily rehearsed and dramatic performance. She wept loudly in the busy corporate lobby. She cried to the passing attorneys and paralegals, claiming that she was a desperate mother trying to save her pregnant daughter from a dangerous man. Yvonne wailed that DeAndre was a violent, abusive husband who was coercing me and isolating me from my loving family. She shouted that DeAndre had manipulated me into having a mental breakdown at a charity event the night before. They wanted to destroy his career to punish me for exposing their golden child. Frantic to stop the spectacle, the receptionist ushered them into a glass-walled boardroom. My parents sat at the long mahogany table, breathing heavily, feeling entirely victorious. They thought they could bully a major corporate law firm into bending to their will, just like they had bullied me for 29 years. 10 minutes later, the heavy boardroom door swung open. Harrison Wright, the ruthless and highly respected managing partner of the firm, walked into the room. He was holding a massive leather-bound portfolio. Calvin immediately stood up, buttoning his suit jacket and extending a hand with a practiced politician's smile. Calvin launched into a desperate speech demanding DeAndre be terminated, citing violent behavior. Yvonne wiped her fake tears, asking Harrison to save her poor brainwashed daughter. Harrison Wright did not shake my father's outstretched hand. He did not offer my mother a tissue. He walked to the head of the mahogany table and dropped the heavy portfolio down with a loud, echoing thud. The sound made Calvin flinch and step back. Harrison looked at my parents with absolute, unblinking disgust. His silence stretched on for several excruciating seconds. The arrogant confidence drained from my father's face, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. Then the side door of the boardroom opened. DeAndre walked in wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, his expression colder than ice. Calvin's face twisted into a snarl. He pointed a shaking finger at my husband and started yelling, demanding that Harrison remove this abusive liar from the premises. Calvin screamed that he would call every major client in Atlanta and ruin the firm if they continued to employ a man who manipulated pregnant women. Harrison raised a single hand, silencing my father instantly. Then he spoke, his voice echoing through the glass-walled room like a death sentence. "Mr. Adams," Harrison said, coldly, lowering his gaze to my father, "you are deeply confused about the hierarchy in this building. DeAndre is not just an employee. You can demand I fire. He is a newly minted senior partner. He owns a significant stake in this entire firm." Calvin's jaw dropped. Yvonne stopped fake crying, her eyes darting frantically. They spent years mocking DeAndre as a low-level paper pusher, not good enough for them. They never knew he was a legal titan. But Harrison was not finished. He tapped his fingers against the heavy leather portfolio he had dropped on the table. "And furthermore, Mr. Adams, you have a much bigger problem today than my partner. Marriage. You barged into our firm, making demands under the assumption that you are a powerful, respected CEO. You are not. Calvin gripped the back of his leather chair, his knees suddenly looking weak. What are you talking about? Calvin stammered out. DeAndre stepped forward, opening the leather portfolio and sliding a thick stack of legally binding contracts directly in front of my father. I am talking about your supply chain company. DeAndre said, his voice a low, lethal rumble. The one you have been mismanaging for years while stealing money from Kiara College Fund to keep yourself afloat. The one you secretly mortgaged to cover Jasmine's shopping habits. Yvonne let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. Calvin stared at the papers, his breathing turning ragged. DeAndre leaned across the mahogany table, staring straight into my father's terrified eyes. Your board of directors held an emergency meeting at dawn today. They were alerted to your massive financial liabilities and the impending federal investigation into your son-in-law. They panicked. They needed a buyout to avoid total bankruptcy. So my firm facilitated a hostile takeover. We just finalized the paperwork 10 minutes ago. DeAndre tapped the signature line on the top document. You are no longer a CEO, Calvin. You do not own the company anymore. You do not even own the company car you drove here in today. The locks on your corporate office have already been changed. You are completely finished. Calvin stared at the thick stack of hostile takeover documents scattered across the polished mahogany table. The arrogant posture he had carried into the corporate law firm completely evaporated. His shoulders slumped forward as his shaking hands reached out to touch the signature lines. The ink was dry. The reality was absolute. The massive supply chain empire he had proudly flaunted at every Atlanta society dinner was no longer his. He was a king stripped of his crown, reduced to a trespasser standing inside a building owned by the very man he had just tried to fire. Yvonne stood frozen beside him. Her eyes darted wildly between the legally binding contracts and Harrison Wright. She realized with a sickening jolt that all her corporate credit cards, the ones she used to fund her extravagant shopping sprees and luxury spa retreats, were now instantly invalid. The wealth she wore like armor had been violently ripped away. Before Calvin could formulate a single word of defense, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open once again. I walked into the room, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I wore a tailored emerald maternity suit that commanded immediate respect. I did not look like the quiet, invisible daughter they had marginalized for 29 years. I looked like the architect of their total destruction. I walked smoothly to the head of the table and took my place directly beside my husband. DeAndre placed a protective, supportive hand on my lower back. We stood as a united, unbreakable front, staring down the two people who had spent a lifetime trying to tear me apart. The sight of me standing there powerful and completely unbothered broke whatever fragile restraint my mother had left. Yvonne lost her mind. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. She lunged forward, her hands curled into fists, but DeAndre instantly stepped into her path, his massive frame completely blocking her from getting anywhere near me. Unable to reach me physically, Yvonne unleashed a torrent of venomous screams. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at my face. "You are a traitor!" Yvonne shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. "You are a disgusting, vindictive traitor. You destroyed your own blood. You ruined this family because you have always been a jealous, bitter little girl. You could never stand the fact that Jasmine was better than you. You orchestrated all of this to destroy us." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I let her scream until her lungs burned. I let her exhaust her toxic entitlement in front of the managing partner of the firm. When she finally paused to gasp for air, I spoke. My voice was deadly calm, carrying a cold, clinical precision that chilled the room. "A traitor?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "You want to talk about family betrayal, Yvonne? Let us talk about the week I turned 18. Let us talk about the night Jasmine took her luxury sports car, got blackout drunk at a country club party, and slammed into a civilian vehicle on a residential street." Yvonne went rigidly still. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like she might faint. Calvin swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the floor. They thought that secret was buried forever. They were wrong. You did not care about the person Jasmine injured in that hit and run. I continued stepping around DeAndre to look my mother dead in the eyes. You only cared about keeping your golden child out of federal prison and protecting your precious social status. But you did not have the liquid cash to pay the massive hush money settlement the victim demanded. So you found another source of funding. You forged my signature. You marched into the bank, presented yourself as my custodial guardian, and you drained my entire college savings account. Every single penny I had saved from working minimum wage shifts after school, every dollar my grandfather had secretly slipped to me, you stole it all. That was for the family. Calvin blurted out, his voice a pathetic, trembling defense. We had to protect your sister. We had to protect our name. You were young, you had time to make that money back. DeAndre slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table, making my father jump. Covering up a felony hit and run using stolen funds from a minor is a federal crime. DeAndre stated, his tone dripping with lethal authority. It is financial fraud, identity theft, and extortion. And since we have the original bank withdrawal slips with Yvonne forged signatures, there is no statute of limitations that can save you now. I turned my focus back to my mother, who was now gripping the edge of the table to keep herself from collapsing. You did not raise me, Yvonne. I said, my words striking her like physical blows. You actively robbed me. You used me as a financial human shield to absorb the consequences of Jasmine criminal behavior. You forced me to take out crippling student loans while you bought your golden child a brand new car to replace the one she totaled. You are not a mother. You are a parasite. And today the host is cutting you off completely, Yvonne stuttered. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly. She searched desperately for a lie, an excuse, a way to gaslight me into believing I was the one in the wrong. But she was staring at a forensic accountant who had spent a decade building an empire of truth. The denial died in her throat. She had absolutely nowhere left to hide. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by Calvin's ragged, panicked breathing. Then a sharp, piercing chime cut through the heavy atmosphere. The sound came from the pocket of my blazer. I reached in and pulled out my smartphone. The screen was flashing with a bright red high-priority alert from the custom fraud detection software I had designed for my accounting firm. I unlocked the screen and read the encrypted notification. My eyes scanned the data, tracking a live digital footprint that was currently pinging a highly secure financial network. A dark, predatory smile curved my lips. I looked up from the glowing screen and stared directly at my ruined parents. The hits just keep coming, I announced, my voice ringing with absolute triumph. It seems your precious white knight is getting desperate. Bradley is currently sitting inside a downtown bank lobby. He is sitting at a loan officer desk right at this very second, attempting to forge my signature to take out a massive second mortgage on my private estate. He thinks he can steal my equity to pay off the violent loan sharks he owes for his illegal offshore gambling syndicate. He thinks he is untouchable. I turned to DeAndre, who was already pulling his phone from his suit jacket to coordinate the final strike. DeAndre met my gaze, a mirror of my own calculating resolve. We do not need to rush, I told my husband softly, slipping my phone back into my pocket. Let Bradley sign the final page. Let him commit federal bank fraud on high-definition security cameras. The trap is already set, and he is walking right into a concrete cell. We did not rush. We did not ever panic. We sat in the back of our Maybach parked across the street from the downtown bank. I watched the digital tracker on my phone sync with the bank network. DeAndre rested his hand over mine, tracing slow circles over my knuckles. Inside that marble lobby, Bradley was putting on the performance of his miserable life. Through the expansive windows, I could see him sitting at the mahogany desk of a senior loan officer. He was leaning forward, flashing that perfectly practiced country club smile. The charm that convinced my parents he was a genius was currently failing to hide the cold sweat gathering along his hairline. Bradley was drowning. He was drowning in offshore crypto debt. He was drowning in illegal sports betting losses. He needed a lifeline. He needed my house. I watched him gesture expansively to the loan officer. He had stolen my personal identification documents from my parents' mansion months ago. He had meticulously forged my signature on the power of attorney paperwork. He actually believed he had outsmarted the quiet, invisible sister. He thought I was weak. He thought I was blind. He thought he could steal from me, just like my mother had stolen from me. But I was not the same bleeding girl anymore. I was not the victim they created. I was the consequence they earned. "Just sign the paper, Bradley," I whispered aloud inside the quiet luxury of the car. "Just sign the paper. Sign away your freedom." Inside the bank, the loan officer pushed a thick stack of finalized mortgage documents across the desk. Bradley snatched the polished silver pen. I could see the slight tremor in his hand, even from across the street. He was seconds away from securing a massive secondary mortgage on my private estate. He pressed the pen to the paper. He forged my name on the first line. He forged my name on the second line. He forged my name on the final binding page of the federal bank document. The signature was fake. His entire existence was fake. He always believed someone else would take the fall. Not this time. The moment he lifted the pen, a silent alarm triggered in the bank's secure system. It was the digital tripwire I had embedded in my accounts 3 days ago. Bradley slumped back in his leather chair, letting out a massive breath of relief. He wiped his sweaty palms on his expensive trousers. He thought he had won. He thought the nightmare was over. It had not even begun. The door to the loan officer private suite swung open abruptly. The bank manager marched in, completely ignoring Bradley. Outstretched hand. He stepped aside, revealing 2 towering federal agents wearing dark suits and ballistic vests. The letters FBI were stamped clearly across their windbreakers. Bradley, arrogant smile vanished instantly. His face drained of all color, leaving him looking like a terrified hollow shell. He stumbled backward, his chair scraping violently against the marble floor. He raised his hands, palms facing outward, babbling a frantic stream of excuses. He tried to use the only defense he had ever known. "Do you know who my family is?" Bradley shouted, his voice cracking with pure panic. "Do you know who my family is? You cannot do this to me. You cannot treat me like some common criminal. Do you know who my family is?" The federal agents did not blink. They did not care about his fake financial pedigree. One agent grabbed Bradley by his tailored shoulder and slammed him face first against the mahogany desk. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs snapping around his wrists echoed through the quiet bank lobby. The sound was the destruction of his entire carefully constructed universe. I opened the car door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. I held a fresh, steaming cup of coffee in my right hand. I walked across the street, my heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the pavement. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the bank lobby. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting wildly around the room. Then he saw me. He saw me standing there, perfectly calm, perfectly composed, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. "Kiara," Bradley gasped, struggling against the grip of the federal agents. "Kiara, tell them, this is a mistake. Tell them you authorized this. Tell them I have your permission." I walked slowly toward him, stopping just out of his reach. I looked him up and down, taking in the messy reality of the man who had tormented me for years. "They know exactly who you are, Bradley," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority that made him flinch. "They know about the forged signatures. They know about the stolen charity funds. In fact, I tipped off the FBI about your wire fraud 3 days ago. I handed them the entire offshore routing history wrapped in a neat digital bow." Bradley stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute horror. The realization crashed down on him, crushing whatever hope he had left. I had orchestrated the entire trap. I had let him walk right into a federal crime just to ensure he would never see the light of day again. "You set me up!" Bradley screamed, his voice shattering into a hysterical, high-pitched wail. "You planned this and enjoy federal prison, Brad," I whispered, taking another slow sip of my coffee. The agents yanked him forward, dragging him toward the main exit. Bradley thrashed wildly, kicking his expensive shoes against the marble floor, screaming my name, screaming threats, screaming for anyone to save him. The heavy glass doors slid open, and he was shoved out into the blinding sunlight, right into the waiting arms of local news crews and flashing cameras. I stood in the quiet, air-conditioned lobby, finishing my coffee and listening to the beautiful, satisfying sound of his screams fading into the distance. I answered the call and put it on speaker so DeAndre could hear. Jasmine was hyperventilating on the other end of the line. The arrogant socialite who had tried to destroy me was now sobbing. "Kiara, please," she begged, her voice cracking with desperation. "They took Bradley. Federal agents just raided our townhouse and seized his computers. You have to help us. Please call a truce. I am begging you." I looked at DeAndre, who raised an eyebrow. "I will meet you at the downtown police precinct," I told my sister. "Bring Yvonne and Calvin. We will settle this family business right now." I ended the call before she could formulate another excuse. 30 minutes later, DeAndre and I walked through the sliding glass doors of the Federal Precinct Processing Center. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare. Jasmine was huddled on a hard plastic bench, her designer mascara running. Yvonne and Calvin stood over her, pacing frantically and barking demands at an indifferent desk sergeant. When Yvonne saw me, her panic warped back into toxic rage. She marched toward me, pointing a trembling, manicured finger. "You fix this right now," Yvonne demanded, her voice echoing. "You call whoever you need to call, and you get Bradley out of that holding cell." I stopped a few feet away and I crossed my arms. "I do not take orders from you, Yvonne," I replied calmly. "And I certainly do not bail out federal criminals." "He is not a criminal!" Calvin shouted, stepping forward to shield his golden daughter. "He made a financial mistake. He was under pressure. You set a trap for your own brother-in-law. You deliberately ruined him." "Bradley ruined himself," I countered, keeping my tone icy and precise. "He stole charity funds to pay off violent bookies and then tried to forge my signature to steal my house." "That is not a mistake, Calvin. That is a series of calculated felonies." Yvonne grabbed my forearm, her nails digging in. "You have the grandfather trust fund now," Yvonne pleaded, her desperation making her voice shrill and erratic. "You have $50 million sitting in those accounts. Use that money to post his bail and hire the best defense team. He is a white man in finance, Kiara. If he gets a felony conviction, his entire career will be ruined over a single piece of paper. You cannot let him go to federal prison. He is family." "Family!" I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. Just like I was family when you drained my college savings to protect Jasmine from her hit and run. Just like I was family when you struck my pregnant stomach at the Thanksgiving table because you wanted Jasmine to inherit the money instead of me. You only use the word family when you need a human shield. Jasmine looked up from the plastic bench, her face a mess. "Please, Kiara." Jasmine sobbed, gripping her handbag. "Bradley said he was fixing our finances. I did not know he was doing anything illegal. If he goes to prison, I will have nothing left. My foundation is gone. My accounts are frozen. We will lose our townhouse." I looked down at the sister who had tormented me my entire life. I looked at the parents who had enabled her every destructive impulse while treating me like garbage. They still believed they could bully me into submission. They still believed their status and their demands meant something to me. They thought Bradley trying to steal my house was the absolute worst thing that could happen to them today. They were incredibly wrong. I unlatched my leather briefcase and reached inside. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not pull out a bail bond agreement. I pulled out a single thick stack of stapled legal documents. "I do not need to bail him out," I said softly, cutting through their demands. I smiled, looking directly into my mother-terrified eyes. "But you might want to look at this." I stepped forward and slid the heavy document directly into Calvin's chest. He fumbled with the paperwork, flipping to the first page. Yvonne leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the bold legal print. "What is this?" Calvin demanded, his voice shaking as he read. "That is a secondary mortgage document," I explained, pacing slowly around them. "You see, Bradley did not just try to mortgage my private estate today. He was desperate, but he was not stupid. He knew he needed massive capital to pay off his offshore syndicates. So 3 months ago, he quietly leveraged the biggest asset he had easy access to." Yvonne stopped breathing. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers as she recognized the property address listed on the front page of the contract. He successfully forged your signatures and mortgaged your multi-million-dollar mansion, I revealed, watching the absolute devastation crash down on my parents' faces. He took out a massive high-interest loan against your house, and he immediately lost all of that money in illegal crypto gambling. He defaulted on the payments 60 days ago. Calvin dropped the paperwork onto the precinct floor, his knees buckling beneath his expensive suit. He grabbed the edge of a trash can to keep from collapsing completely. Yvonne let out a sound that was half gasp and half scream. "You did not just lose your supply chain company today, Calvin," I stated my words, driving the final nail into their pristine fake empire. "The bank finalized the paperwork yesterday. Your mansion is actively being foreclosed upon today. The sheriff deputies are currently changing the locks on your front doors and moving your furniture onto the front lawn. You do not have a home anymore." Yvonne stared at me, her entire world completely and utterly annihilated. The parents realized in that cold, sterile room that they were entirely homeless. They had absolutely nothing left to their name now. Yvonne's legs gave out completely. She crumpled to the linoleum floor of the police precinct, her designer handbag spilling its contents across the scuffed tiles. The manicured facade she had maintained for decades shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She let out a high-pitched wail, grabbing her chest as the reality of her sudden homelessness crushed the air from her lungs. Calvin did not bend down to help his wife. Instead, his panic instantly mutated into a vicious, primal rage. He spun around and lunged at his golden child. Calvin grabbed Jasmine by the shoulders, shaking her violently. "You brought that parasite into our house!" Calvin roared, his voice echoing off the concrete walls and drawing the attention of every desk sergeant in the room. "You married a criminal. You let that white con artist steal the roof over our heads just to fund your fake charity galas. You destroyed us, Jasmine." Jasmine shoved her father away, her own face contorted with panic and fury. "Do not blame me for your stupidity," Jasmine screamed right back at him, her voice cracking. "You signed the paperwork, Calvin. You were so desperate to impress his old money family that you handed over your financial power of attorney without reading the fine print. You gave him the keys to the kingdom." I stood beside DeAndre and watched the picture-perfect Atlanta family tear each other to shreds. For 29 years, they had presented a united, impenetrable front to the world. They had spent my entire life making me the villain so they could play the heroes. But the second their wealth was stripped away, their loyalty vanished. They were a pack of wild dogs turning on each other over a single scrap of meat. DeAndre pulled me slightly behind him, ensuring I was shielded from the physical chaos erupting between my father and sister. "We do not need to say another word," DeAndre whispered to me, his eyes tracking Calvin's erratic movements. "Let them finish the job themselves." I nodded, feeling a profound sense of closure washing over my entire body. I did not feel pity. I did not feel guilt. I felt the pure, unadulterated justice of consequence. The heavy security doors of the precinct hissed open again. The shouting between Calvin and Jasmine abruptly died down. Judge Sterling marched into the holding area. She was not alone. Behind the formidable executor of my grandfather's estate stood 4 individuals wearing severe business suits and carrying heavy briefcases. The bold gold lettering on their badges caught the harsh fluorescent light. They were federal agents from the Internal Revenue Service. Judge Sterling brought her heavy wooden cane down hard against the precinct floor. The sharp, violent crack of the wood echoing through the room commanded absolute silence. Yvonne whimpered from the floor, looking up at the judge with sheer terror in her eyes. Calvin took a slow, stumbling step backward. "Yvonne and Calvin," Judge Sterling announced, her voice booming with unquestionable authority. "Your active complicity in Bradley offshore wire fraud and your gross negligence regarding the family assets officially violates the morality clause of your stewardship. You failed to protect the estate. You enabled financial crimes to fund a fraudulent lifestyle. I am freezing every remaining dime under your names. But that is not the worst of your problems today." Judge Sterling gestured to the IRS agents standing rigidly behind her. The federal government has been notified of your massive offshore tax liabilities. As the executor of the trust, I am legally obligated to protect the primary beneficiary. Therefore, I am officially initiating a full, relentless forensic audit of every single penny you two have touched in the last 10 years. The agents stepped forward, opening their briefcases and presenting Calvin with a thick stack of federal subpoenas. Your country club memberships are revoked. Your vehicles will be seized by the end of the day. You are going to account for every dollar you stole from Kiara and every dollar you funneled into Jasmine's fraudulent empire. Jasmine backed away until her shoulders hit the cold cinder block wall of the precinct. Her foundation was gone. Her husband was going to federal prison. Her parents were completely destitute and facing federal tax evasion charges. The golden child had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. She looked at me standing there in my immaculate emerald maternity suit, protected by a brilliant husband and a $50 million trust fund. The sheer absolute jealousy in her eyes was toxic enough to burn a hole through the wall. Just beyond the glass doors of the precinct, the flashing lights of cameras started to multiply. The paparazzi had followed the police scanners and tracked the wealthy, disgraced family to the downtown station. The media vultures were hungry for the next chapter of the Atlanta society scandal. Jasmine saw the cameras through the glass. Her mind snapped into a desperate, terrifying survival mode. She needed a lifeline. She needed to change the narrative before the reporters printed the truth about her bankrupt reality. Jasmine locked eyes with me. A sick, twisted smile flashed across her face for a fraction of a second before she launched into the most dangerous performance of her life. Jasmine let out a blood-curdling shriek. She collapsed heavily against the precinct wall, sliding down to the floor and clutching her flat stomach with both hands. She began to sob hysterically, making sure her voice carried through the glass doors to the waiting reporters outside. The camera flashes intensified, capturing her theatrical agony. "Help me," Jasmine screamed at the top of her lungs, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at me. "She is trying to kill my innocent baby. I am currently pregnant too. I am carrying the first grandchild. Kiara is stressing me into a massive miscarriage so she can easily steal the entire trust fund all for herself. Someone arrest her right now. Please save my precious unborn baby." The camera flashes exploded around us as Jasmine thrashed on the cold linoleum floor. Paramedics already in the precinct rushed over, playing right into her meticulously crafted illusion. They loaded my sister onto a stretcher while she continued to clutch her completely flat stomach, wailing about the safety of her unborn child. The local news crews caught every single second, broadcasting it live across Atlanta. By the time DeAndre and I drove back to our secured estate, the narrative had violently shifted. The media devoured Jasmine's claims. My phone began to vibrate relentlessly with hateful messages from anonymous accounts. They wanted a villain, and Jasmine painted me as the ultimate monster. The public sympathy that had just started turning against my corrupt family was instantly hijacked by her crocodile tears. People inherently protect a vulnerable pregnant victim, and Jasmine knew exactly how to weaponize that biological shield. She manipulated the optics so flawlessly that reporters were already parked at the end of our very street. The very next morning, Jasmine escalated her highly malicious campaign. She orchestrated an exclusive live interview from her luxury VIP suite at the private hospital. She looked directly into the camera lens and squeezed out a single perfect tear. "My sister attacked me because she wants all the trust fund money for herself." Jasmine whimpered on national television, her voice breaking with fake grief. "I am currently having a high-risk pregnancy and Kiara bullying me is pushing me toward a miscarriage. I just want my baby to be safe from her violent outbursts." Within an hour of that broadcast airing, a courier arrived at our front gate. He handed our security guard a thick manila envelope from a sleazy local litigation firm. Calvin and Yvonne had officially sent a legal demand letter. They threatened to sue me for $10 million in emotional distress damages and attempted fetal harm if I did not immediately release the trust fund capital to support the true heir. They were using a non-existent fetus as a financial hostage to force my hand. DeAndre paced our expansive home office, absolutely furious. He tossed the demand letter onto my desk. "We need to file an immediate injunction." DeAndre stated, his legal mind working at lightning speed. "If we do not stop this right now, the court might actually freeze the trust fund indefinitely, pending a medical evaluation." We hit them with a massive defamation suit today. We formally subpoena her medical records through standard discovery and drag her fraudulent claims into a courtroom. I shook my head, staring at the glowing monitors of my forensic workstation. "Standard discovery takes many months," I replied, my voice cold and laser-focused. "Jasmine can do catastrophic public damage while she pretends to carry this child. Litigation is your weapon, DeAndre. Raw data is mine." I turned my attention back to my encrypted financial software. People can easily lie on television, but money never lies. Jasmine maintained her flawless aesthetic by using one of the most expensive private concierge doctors in the prestigious Buckhead district. I knew her vanity would never let her use a standard public hospital. I ran a deep algorithmic sweep through the offshore shell accounts Yvonne and Calvin used to pay Jasmine's medical retainers over the past decade. I tracked the routing numbers, bypassing standard medical firewalls, by following raw monetary transactions instead of health records. It took 4 grueling hours of digital digging to find the exact ledger I needed. I cross-referenced the hidden date stamps with the procedural billing codes submitted to their private wealth insurance provider. When the final decryption key unlocked the archived file, I let out a sharp, cold laugh. "I found the gun," I told DeAndre. "Get me an expedited subpoena now. We are paying a very unpleasant visit to a certain doctor." We drove straight to the exclusive medical plaza in the wealthiest district of the city. I did not wait for the receptionist to announce our arrival. I pushed straight through the frosted glass doors and marched directly into the private office of Dr. Harrison Lockwood. He looked up from his mahogany desk, startled by the intrusion. "Excuse me," Dr. Lockwood sputtered. "You cannot just barge in here. This is a highly secure private medical practice." I walked straight up to his desk and slammed a thick, court-ordered subpoena directly onto his pristine leather blotter. DeAndre stepped into the doorway behind me, crossing his arms and physically blocking any chance of escape. "You have been treating Jasmine Adams for 10 years, I stated, leaning over the desk and staring the doctor down with absolute lethal intent. "You went on television this morning and issued a vague statement about her high-risk stress levels to the press. You lent your medical credibility to a federal fraud scheme." Dr. Lockwood swallowed hard. "I have strict patient confidentiality rules," he stammered, his voice shaking. "I cannot discuss her pregnancy with you under any circumstances. You are going to discuss it right now," I commanded, tapping my manicured fingernail against the second page of the subpoena. "Because this federal document compels you to explain your financial records to a forensic auditor." I turned the page over, revealing the decrypted billing ledger I extracted from his hidden accounts. I pointed to a specific 12-digit alphanumeric code printed in stark black ink. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush him completely. "I know exactly what this code means, Dr. Lockwood," I whispered. "This code is from exactly 5 years ago. It was billed to my parents' private offshore account for a completely elective surgical procedure." The doctor went pale. His posture collapsed as blood rushed out of his face. He realized in that agonizing second that I possessed the absolute, undeniable truth. I did not just have a wild suspicion about my sister. I had the exact financial receipt that proved Jasmine's entire high-risk pregnancy was a massive, calculated, and biologically impossible lie. Dr. Lockwood crumpled into his leather chair, completely defeated. The arrogant physician suddenly looked like a terrified child. He stared at the decrypted billing ledger in my hand, knowing his medical career was hanging by a fragile thread. "You committed insurance fraud and aided a federal extortion scheme," I told him, keeping my voice quiet. "I can hand this ledger to the medical board right now and watch you lose your license, or you can open your filing cabinet and hand me the certified copies of the medical history of my sister." Dr. Lockwood did not hesitate at all. He scrambled out of his chair, his hands shaking as he unlocked the heavy metal cabinet. He pulled out a red folder and shoved it into the waiting hands of DeAndre. "I am cooperating," Dr. Lockwood pleaded, his voice cracking. I am giving you everything you requested. Please do not destroy my practice. DeAndre flipped through the official documents verifying the signatures and the hospital stamps. We have what we need, DeAndre said, sliding the folder into his briefcase. We turned our backs on the ruined doctor and walked out of the clinic, leaving him to panic in his office. We had the ultimate weapon, and it was time to use it. By the time we arrived at the main hospital, the media circus was in full swing. Jasmine had truly outdone herself. She orchestrated a massive live press conference right on the front steps of the medical facility. She was sitting in a wheelchair looking tragically fragile, wearing a designer silk robe. Yvonne and Calvin stood protectively on either side of her, playing the roles of devastated parents to perfection. Calvin was gripping the handles of the wheelchair while Yvonne dabbed at her dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. Local news crews and reporters had set up their cameras, eagerly eating up the manufactured drama. We parked the Maybach out of sight and watched the live feed on my phone. Jasmine leaned forward toward the cluster of microphones. Her voice trembled with fake vulnerability. My sister Kiara is a monster, Jasmine cried out, wiping away a fake tear. She is using her financial power to terrorize me during this vulnerable time. I am currently carrying the true heir to the estate of our grandfather, and the stress she is causing is putting my unborn baby in critical danger. I beg Kiara to release the trust fund. She is trying to stress me into a miscarriage just so she can steal the money for herself. Yvonne stepped up to the microphones, placing a hand over her heart. We are a family in mourning, Yvonne wailed, playing her part. We just want our grandchild to be safe. We are publicly begging Kiara to stop this violent bullying and surrender the funds before it is too late. The reporters shouted questions, eating up every word of the victim narrative. They wanted a villain, and my family fed them a masterpiece. I turned off my phone, looking at DeAndre. It is time, I said, opening the car door. I stepped out onto the pavement wearing a crimson maternity dress that commanded respect. I held the thick red medical folder tightly in my right hand. As I walked toward the hospital steps, the reporters at the back noticed me first. A ripple of murmurs spread through the press pool until every camera swiveled away from Jasmine and pointed directly at me. The sudden shift in attention made my sister look up. Her tragic expression faltered for a second when she saw me marching toward her. Yvonne saw me and went on the offensive. She pointed a shaking finger at me, trying to maintain control. You have some nerve showing up here, Yvonne shouted. Get away from your sister. You have done enough damage to this family. Are you here to attack me? Calvin stepped in front of the wheelchair, trying to block my path, but DeAndre effortlessly moved him aside, clearing a direct line to the microphones. I did not scream. I did not yell. I did not let any emotion leak into my voice. I walked straight up to the cluster of microphones, completely ignoring the frantic protests of my parents. The camera flashes were blinding, but I stared directly into the main broadcasting lens. My sister is not pregnant, I announced, my voice ringing out with clinical clarity. The courtyard fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The reporters stopped shouting. The face of Jasmine turned a horrifying shade of pale as she gripped the armrests. That is a disgusting lie, Yvonne shrieked, trying to grab the microphones. You are a jealous, bitter liar. I ignored my mother and held up the red medical folder for every camera to capture. I just came from the private office of Dr. Harrison Lockwood, I stated, projecting my voice so the entire city could hear. I hold in my hand the certified medical records belonging to Jasmine Adams. She is not having a high-risk pregnancy. She is not having a pregnancy at all. She has not been capable of getting pregnant for 5 years. Jasmine let out a strangled, gasping sound. Her eyes darted wildly, looking for an escape route, but the reporters had surrounded the stairs. Calvin dropped his hands from the wheelchair, staring at me in shock. I unsealed the folder and pulled out the primary surgical document, holding it up high. My sister had her fallopian tubes tied 5 years ago. Because she did not want to ruin her body, I declared delivering the final devastating blow. She has been faking her infertility struggles this entire time, manipulating my parents out of millions of dollars, and she invented this fake pregnancy to steal the $50 million trust fund. She never wanted to be a mother at all. She only wanted the absolute power and the endless luxury that came with the inheritance of my grandfather. Today, her entire empire of lies collapses. The absolute truth shattered the press conference with the force of a detonated bomb. For a fraction of a second, the courtyard was trapped in a stunned, breathless vacuum. The reporters lowered their microphones, staring at the red medical folder in my hand. Jasmine was not pregnant. She never was. The $50 million extortion scheme collapsed on live television. Yvonne slowly turned her head to look at her golden child. The performative grief melted off my mother's face, replaced by an agonizing, horrifying realization. "You lied to us," Yvonne whispered, her voice caught by the boom microphone stationed around the wheelchair. "You told us you were giving us a grandchild, Jasmine. You made us pay for those expensive fertility treatments." Jasmine did not look at our mother. She kept her unhinged gaze locked entirely on me. Her manicured facade ripped apart, revealing the dark, venomous core she had hidden for 3 decades. The cameras started flashing wildly, a relentless strobe light capturing the exact moment the beloved Atlanta socialite lost her mind. Jasmine let out a feral, piercing scream that echoed violently off the hospital walls. It was the sound of pure, terrifying desperation. She leaped up from the wheelchair, proving her physical frailty was just another lie. She grabbed the heavy metal microphone stand positioned in front of her. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled rage, Jasmine slammed the stand down against the concrete steps. The heavy base snapped off, leaving a jagged, sharp metal pole in her hands. "You were supposed to be the failure," Jasmine shrieked, wielding the broken rod like a spear. "You were supposed to be the invisible scapegoat. You ruined my life, Kiara. I'm going to gut you and that parasite inside you." She lunged directly at me on live television. She did not aim for my chest or my face. Jasmine aimed the jagged edge of the broken metal stand straight for my pregnant belly, intending to harm the true heir to the grandfather trust fund. Time seemed to slow down. The reporters screamed, scattering backward. I planted my feet, refusing to back away from the woman who had terrorized my entire existence. I knew I was not alone. Before Jasmine could even bring the weapon within striking distance, DeAndre moved with lethal, terrifying speed. My husband did not hesitate. He lunged laterally, throwing his muscular frame directly into Jasmine's path. DeAndre tackled my sister to the hard pavement. The jagged metal pole clattered harmlessly across the asphalt. Jasmine hit the ground with a heavy impact, screaming as DeAndre pinned her arms firmly behind her back, neutralizing the threat instantly. "Do not move!" DeAndre roared, his voice booming with the absolute authority of a man protecting his family. The hospital security guards and the local police officers who had been managing the press conference perimeter swarmed the hospital steps immediately. Uniformed officers grabbed Jasmine, hauling her up from the concrete. They restrained her against a parked news van, pulling her wrists into tight steel handcuffs. "Get your hands off me!" Jasmine thrashed wildly, her designer silk robe torn and stained with dirt. "I am Jasmine Adams. You cannot arrest me. My sister is the criminal. She made me do this. Read her rights." A senior officer commanded, ignoring her frantic delusions. "You are under arrest for attempted assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, and filing a false police report." The cameras captured every angle of the golden child being read her Miranda rights, covered in grime and sobbing tears of defeat. Calvin stood frozen near the empty wheelchair, his world annihilated. The supply chain company was gone. The mansion was foreclosed. His wife was facing tax evasion charges. And now his favored daughter was being dragged into a squad car for attempted murder on live television. Calvin realized he had nothing left. The arrogance that defined his entire life drained out of him. He looked at the flashing police lights, then looked at me standing safely behind my husband. My father stumbled forward, his legs giving out. Calvin dropped to his knees right there in the dirty hospital parking lot. The man who had mocked my degree, ignored my achievements, and allowed his wife to hurt my unborn child was now weeping on the pavement. "Kiara, please." Calvin begged, his voice cracking as tears streamed down his weathered face. "Tell the officers to stop. Tell them not to press charges against your sister. She is sick. She does not know what she is doing. You have the grandfather trust fund now. You can afford the best lawyers to keep her out of prison. We are still your family. You cannot just let them take my daughter away like a criminal. Please forgive us. I am begging you to forgive your family." I looked down at the pathetic, weeping man kneeling at my heels. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for him. I felt the profound, satisfying weight of undeniable justice. I stepped out from behind DeAndre, looking down at my father with eyes as cold as ice. "You did not beg for forgiveness when you locked me out of the house in the snow, Calvin," I stated, my voice projecting clearly for the cameras. "You did not beg for forgiveness when you allowed Yvonne to drain my bank accounts. You blindly stood by and watched Jasmine try to completely destroy my reputation, my entire career, and my child. You enabled a monster because you cared more about status than doing what was right." The two police officers forcefully pushed a violently screaming Jasmine into the back of the waiting squad car, slamming the heavy metal door shut behind her. I looked down at Calvin one last time, sealing his miserable fate completely. "You chose your daughter," I whispered. The chilling finality of the statement rang loudly through the quiet hospital courtyard. "Now live with her and the ruin she created." 48 hours after my sister was dragged into the back of a police cruiser, the deafening chaos of the media circus was replaced by the suffocating silence of a judicial chamber. We were sitting inside the austere, mahogany-lined office of Judge Sterling. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the relentless Atlanta sun, and the probing lenses of the paparazzi camped outside the courthouse. DeAndre sat closely beside me, his hand resting firmly on my knee, radiating a quiet, impenetrable strength. Across the polished conference table sat the physical remains of my parents. Calvin and Yvonne looked as though they had aged 2 decades in 2 days. Stripped of their stolen luxury and their manicured socialite facade, they were completely unrecognizable. Yvonne was not wearing her signature diamonds. Her hair was flat and her hands shook violently in her lap. Calvin stared blankly at the wood grain, a hollow shell of a man who traded his legacy for a daughter sitting in a jail cell awaiting a bail hearing she could not afford. Judge Sterling sat at the head of the table. She did not offer pleasantries. She opened a thick leather-bound ledger and dropped it onto the table with a heavy thud that made my mother flinch. "The forensic audit mandated by the court is officially complete," Judge Sterling announced, her voice devoid of any warmth. The Internal Revenue Service, alongside independent financial investigators, combed through every single bank account, shell corporation, and hidden offshore asset tied to your names, Yvonne and Calvin. The results are the most egregious display of fiduciary negligence and embezzlement I have witnessed on the bench. Calvin closed his eyes tightly. "You used your position as stewards of this family estate to actively siphon capital." Judge Sterling continued tapping a silver pen against the damning ledger. "You funneled millions into fraudulent charity ventures to boost your country club standing. You allowed a known con artist to leverage family properties. You treated a generational wealth trust like your personal piggy bank, using it to buy the affection of a daughter who committed attempted murder to sustain her lifestyle." "We were trying to protect our family," Yvonne whispered, her voice raspy. "We were trying to protect our image. Bradley lied to us. Jasmine lied to us. We did not know the extent of their crimes. We are victims too." "Do not insult my intelligence," Yvonne, Judge Sterling snapped, shutting the ledger forcefully. "You were not victims. You were active, greedy participants who looked the other way because the fraud funded your vanity. You are legally and entirely ruined." Yvonne let out a choked sob, burying her face in her hands. Calvin remained completely paralyzed by his impending federal tax evasion charges. I watched them break down and felt absolutely nothing. The emotional cord had been violently severed. Judge Sterling pushed the ledger aside and reached under her heavy wooden desk. She pulled out a rectangular object and placed it carefully in the center of the table. It was a heavy vintage safe deposit box, constructed of solid steel and covered in a fine layer of dust. The brass lock was engraved with the unmistakable initials of my late grandfather. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up straighter, staring at the steel box. "When your grandfather drafted the $50 million trust, he gave me explicit instructions," Judge Sterling explained, pulling a small brass key from her robes. He knew exactly what kind of people his son and daughter-in-law had become. He anticipated this exact catastrophic failure. He instructed me to open this specific lockbox only when the trust was successfully transferred to the rightful heir, or when the family attempted a hostile takeover. She inserted the key and turned it. The heavy lid popped open with a sharp click. Judge Sterling reached inside and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. She broke the seal and unfolded a handwritten letter. The familiar, sharp, cursive script of my grandfather immediately brought a stinging heat to my eyes. Judge Sterling cleared her throat and began to read his final words aloud. To my family, if this letter is being read, it means the worst of my suspicions have been realized. Calvin, you were always a weak man, easily blinded by the illusion of power rather than the substance of hard work. Yvonne, your soul is as shallow as the luxury you worship. I watched you two parade Jasmine around like a prized show pony, inflating her ego, until she became nothing more than a hollow vessel of your own pathetic vanity. I knew you would poison her. I knew you would ultimately try to steal the generational wealth I built to feed your insatiable greed. Yvonne let out a sharp gasp, her eyes widening in horror as the voice of the dead patriarch reached beyond the grave to condemn her completely. But I also watched Kiara. The letter continued. Judge Sterling's voice softened slightly as she read my name. I watched you two marginalize her. I watched you punish her for possessing the very intellect and integrity you both lacked. I saw the quiet, brilliant girl sitting in the shadows of this family, absorbing your cruelty without letting it destroy her moral compass. A single tear slipped down my cheek. I quickly wiped it away, but the validation of his words struck deep into my chest. He had seen me. He had always seen me. I knew Kiara was the only one in this bloodline who possessed my iron spine. Judge Sterling read the final paragraph, her eyes lifting from the paper to meet mine. I knew she would need an impenetrable fortress to survive the inevitable betrayal of her own parents. That is why 10 years ago, I did not just leave her to fend for herself. I secretly funded her forensic accounting firm through a blind proxy. Every major corporate client and silent investor that helped her build her multi-million-dollar agency was orchestrated by me. The air vanished from my lungs. The entire room spun. My parents stared at me, their jaws completely slack with shock. They realized in that devastating moment that the very empire I used to destroy them was financed by the man they thought they had outsmarted. I looked at DeAndre, my vision blurring with overwhelming emotion. I was never a self-made outcast fighting completely alone in the dark. My entire empire, my strength, my ability to fight back and win was built securely on the unyielding, silent love of my grandfather. The silence in the austere judicial chamber was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own steady breathing. I looked at the handwritten letter resting on the heavy wooden desk, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. My grandfather had reached across time to protect me. He had forged my armor and given me the exact tools I needed to survive the toxic environment I was raised in. But that beautiful moment of realization was instantly shattered by the ugly parasitic greed of my mother. Yvonne did not feel shame. She did not feel an ounce of remorse for how she had treated me my entire life. Instead, her eyes narrowed, locking onto the final words my grandfather had written. Her panic and desperation violently mutated into pure toxic entitlement. She slammed her hands down on the polished mahogany table and leaned forward, her face twisting into a greedy snarl. If family money funded your business, Yvonne demanded, her voice shrill and commanding, then that business belongs to the family estate. Calvin and I are your parents. We are the direct descendants of that man. That proxy money was part of our rightful inheritance. We are legally entitled to a massive percentage of your firm. Calvin suddenly sat up straight. His pathetic weeping stopped instantly. The prospect of unearned money brought the arrogant life back into his eyes. He looked at Judge Sterling with renewed confidence. She is exactly right, Calvin agreed, puffing out his chest. If my father seeded her company using assets that should have gone directly to me, then her forensic accounting agency is family property. We want 50% of her gross revenue immediately. That money will save us from bankruptcy and pay for our legal defense. I looked at the two people sitting across from me. They had just lost their mansion. Their golden child was sitting in a jail cell facing decades behind bars. Their son-in-law was headed to federal prison. They were facing catastrophic tax evasion charges and total public ruin. Yet their very first instinct was to try and cannibalize my hard-earned success. DeAndre let out a deep, mocking laugh that echoed off the chamber walls. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. You two truly are the most delusional people I have ever met in my entire legal career, DeAndre stated smoothly. You have absolutely zero legal standing to claim a single penny from a private proxy investment. I do not need your legal opinion, Yvonne spat at DeAndre. She glared directly at me. You owe us, Kiara. You owe us for raising you. You owe us a piece of your empire. Hand over the company shares right now. I slowly wiped the single tear from my cheek. The warmth I felt for my grandfather evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating predator instinct. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with their delusion. I simply reached into my heavy leather briefcase and pulled out my sleek silver laptop. You want to talk about my empire, Yvonne? I asked quietly, booting up the encrypted device. You want to discuss the corporate structure of my firm and how it relates to your daily life? We can absolutely do that. I typed in my administrative password and pulled up a highly classified corporate ownership map. My firm did not just handle forensic accounting. We aggressively acquired distressed assets and managed elite wealth portfolios across the state. I turned the glowing screen around and pushed the laptop across the table so my parents could see the intricate web of corporate logos and legal names. Look closely at the screen, I instructed, tapping my manicured finger against the top left corner. This is the Buckhead Pinnacle Country Club. It is the most exclusive, pretentious social club in Atlanta. It is the place where you spend 6 days a week sipping mimosas, gossiping about your friends, and pretending you are royalty. Yvonne stared at the country club logo, her eyes darting to the connecting lines on the screen. And right here, I continued, tracing a line to the center of the display, is the holding group for the Michelin star restaurants Calvin uses to wine and dine his golf buddies. The places where he drops $5,000 on a single dinner just to show off his wealth. Calvin squinted at the screen, his breathing becoming shallow, as he failed to understand what I was showing them. Finally, look at this subsidiary, I said, pointing to the bottom right corner. This is the Premium Automotive Leasing Syndicate. This is the exact company that holds the titles to your brand new luxury sport utility vehicle and the expensive sedan Calvin drove to my husband's law firm. Why are you showing us this? Yvonne snapped, clearly getting nervous. We know where we eat and what we drive. What does this have to do with you giving us our percentage of your business? Trace the lines, Yvonne, DeAndre commanded, his voice dripping with lethal satisfaction. Trace the corporate ownership lines all the way to the top of the pyramid. My mother and father followed the digital lines connecting the country club, the restaurant group, and the luxury car leasing syndicate. All three massive entities flowed upward, merging into a single parent holding company. Then that holding company flowed upward into one final, undeniable corporate entity at the very top of the screen. The name of my forensic accounting firm flashed in bold, unmistakable letters. Calvin's jaw dropped completely open. He looked like he had forgotten how to breathe. Yvonne's hands began to shake so violently that she had to pull them off the table. They stared at the screen in absolute horror as the crushing reality of their situation finally penetrated their greedy minds. You do not own a percentage of me, I stated, leaning over the table and staring directly into my mother's terrified eyes. I own you. The silence in the judicial chamber was heavy and absolute. Judge Sterling sat back in her chair, a faint, deeply satisfied smile playing on her lips. My firm bought out the holding company that owns your entire luxury lifestyle exactly 2 years ago, I revealed, twisting the knife with clinical precision. Every time you swiped your card at the country club, you were paying me. Every time Calvin ordered an expensive steak, the profit went into my accounts. I am the silent landlord of your entire existence. Yvonne stumbled backward in her chair, shaking her head in frantic denial. No, that is impossible. You cannot own our cars. You cannot own the club. I absolutely can, and I do. I replied, standing up and closing the laptop with a sharp, echoing snap. And because my firm owns the leasing syndicate, we have the right to review the financial stability of our clients. Since your mansion is currently being foreclosed upon, and your bank accounts are entirely frozen by federal agents, you no longer meet the financial requirements of our premium contracts. Calvin let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. Kiara, please. You cannot do this. I already did, I told my father coldly. As of this morning, your luxury vehicle leases are officially terminated. My recovery agents are currently towing your cars from the precinct parking lot. Your country club memberships are permanently revoked, and you are banned for life from every restaurant in that hospitality group. The crushing weight of my words slammed into Calvin with the force of a freight train. The arrogant patriarch, who had spent his entire life looking down his nose at me, finally understood that he had absolutely nothing left. He did not have a company. He did not have a mansion. He did not even have the least luxury sedan sitting in the parking lot. Calvin stared at the blank screen of my laptop, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. The reality of his complete and total ruin fractured his mind. He turned his head slowly, his bloodshot eyes locking onto my mother. The polished, united front they had maintained for 30 years instantly vaporized. The survival instinct kicked in, and Calvin needed a scapegoat. Since he could no longer use me, he turned his vicious, cowardly wrath directly onto his wife. "This is your fault," Calvin hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and unadulterated rage. He pointed a shaking finger right at Yvonne's face. "You brought that criminal into our house. You practically forced Jasmine to marry Bradley because you were so desperate to secure a connection to old money. You handed him my financial power of attorney on a silver platter because you wanted to brag to your country club friends about your wealthy white son-in-law." Yvonne recoiled as if she had been burned with a hot iron. Her eyes darted frantically around the austere judicial chambers, looking for a way to escape the humiliation. When she realized there was no audience left to manipulate, her panic morphed into a vicious defensive snarl. "How dare you blame me?" Yvonne shrieked, her voice echoing sharply off the heavy mahogany walls. "You signed those banking documents, Calvin. You were the chief executive officer of a massive supply chain company, and you were too stupid to read the fine print. Do not try to pin your pathetic business failures on my shoulders. You lost our home. You lost our empire. I lost it because I was busy paying off the mountain of debt you and your golden child accumulated." Calvin roared back, pushing his chair away and standing up to tower over her. The remaining shreds of his dignity disintegrated. "You think I did not know what was going on behind the scenes. You think I was blind to the financial crimes you committed right under my roof." Yvonne froze, the color draining completely from her cheeks. "Keep your voice down," she whispered frantically, glancing nervously at Judge Sterling, who was sitting perfectly still at the head of the table, observing the implosion with cold judicial calculation. But Calvin was too far gone to care about the legal consequences. He was a drowning man determined to drag his wife down into the abyss with him. He turned to me, his eyes wide and frantic, desperate to shift the blame. "I knew about the college fund," Kiara. Calvin confessed, his voice echoing violently through the room. "I knew your mother forged your signature 10 years ago. I saw the bank statements the very next morning. I watched her drain every single penny of your college savings to pay off the victim of Jasmine's hit and run." My husband DeAndre shifted his weight, his broad shoulders tensing as he prepared to intervene, but I placed a gentle hand on his arm to stop him. I did not need protection from Calvin's confession. I just wanted to watch them bleed. "I knew she robbed you," Calvin shouted, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "But I let her do it. I looked the other way because I needed Jasmine to stop crying, and I needed Yvonne to stop screaming at me about the country club dues. I let her steal your future so I could have peace and quiet in my own house. She is the monster, Kiara. She is the one who destroyed you. Punish her, not me." Yvonne let out a guttural, animalistic scream. The realization that her husband had just confessed to a federal financial crime in front of a sitting judge and a senior corporate attorney completely broke her mind. She lunged forward with explosive speed. Her hand whipped through the air, and the sharp, echoing crack of her palm striking Calvin's cheek silenced the entire room. The slap was brutal, fueled by decades of suppressed resentment and absolute panic. Calvin stumbled backward, clutching his face as a bright red mark instantly materialized across his jawline. "You are a weak, pathetic excuse for a man." Yvonne spat, her voice dripping with pure, concentrated venom. "You sold me out to save your own skin. You could not even protect your own assets from a white con artist. You let Bradley walk right into our home and steal the roof over our heads because you were so desperate to be accepted by his fake family. You are nothing, Calvin. You are a bankrupt, useless coward." The perfect Atlanta family was dead. They were screaming over each other, airing every toxic secret, every financial infidelity, and every vicious betrayal they had committed over the past 30 years. They had no money, no cars, no house, no status, and now they had absolutely no loyalty left to each other. They were entirely alone, trapped in a nightmare of their own making. I sat back in my leather chair, resting my hand gently on my pregnant belly, and watched the fire burn. It was the most beautiful, satisfying spectacle I had ever witnessed in my entire life. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the judge's chambers clicked open, cutting through the chaotic screaming match. A sharply dressed legal assistant stepped into the room, bringing the vicious argument to a grinding halt. The assistant carried a polished silver tray, and resting in the center of the tray was a thick ivory-colored legal document. It was the final authorization paperwork for the $50 million grandfather trust. The ultimate prize. The absolute transfer of generational wealth that my parents had literally destroyed their lives trying to steal. The assistant walked silently to the head of the long table and placed the silver tray directly in front of Judge Sterling. Calvin and Yvonne stopped breathing. Their eyes were glued to the ivory paper, the last remaining symbol of the empire they had lost. They watched with tortured, agonizing regret as Judge Sterling picked up her heavy fountain pen to sign the money over to me forever. But Judge Sterling did not sign the paper. She adjusted her reading glasses and flipped the heavy document to the final page to verify the legal signatures. Her hand stopped moving. Her sharp, authoritative eyes widened in genuine surprise. She reached out and touched a thick, embossed red wax seal located at the very bottom of the parchment. It was a seal that had remained completely unbroken for a decade. "Wait," Judge Sterling announced, her voice echoing with a sudden profound gravity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She looked up from the document, her gaze locking directly onto me. "There is a heavy red seal on the back page. It is labeled the Hidden Clause." The oppressive silence in the judicial chamber grew so thick it felt like it could crush the breath right out of our lungs. Calvin and Yvonne stared at the thick ivory paper resting on the mahogany desk. Their eyes were completely transfixed on the heavy red wax seal that Judge Sterling was carefully examining. A hidden clause. The very phrase seemed to suck the remaining warmth from the room. My grandfather was a man who planned for every possible contingency. He built his real estate empire by anticipating the worst in people, and he knew exactly how dark the hearts of his own children could become when $50 million was on the line. Yvonne leaned forward in her leather chair. Her manicured fingers gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned bright white. "What does it say?" Yvonne demanded, her voice shaking with a pathetic mixture of terror and desperate greed. "If it is a hidden clause about the estate distribution, then Calvin and I have a legal right to hear it immediately. We are his direct descendants. We still have our monthly executive pensions from the family trust. That money belongs to us." Judge Sterling did not look at my mother. She picked up a sharp silver letter opener from her desk. With a slow, deliberate motion, she slid the metal blade under the heavy red wax. The seal cracked open with a loud, satisfying snap that made Calvin flinch violently. Judge Sterling unfolded the thick parchment extension. She adjusted her reading glasses and scanned the handwritten text. A cold, razor-sharp smile slowly spread across the face of the formidable judge. She looked up from the document, her eyes locking directly onto my parents. "Your father was a visionary man, Calvin," Judge Sterling announced, her voice echoing with absolute finality. "He knew you and your wife would stop at nothing to steal this generational wealth from Kiara. He knew you would try to use your parental authority to manipulate her, and he deeply feared you might resort to physical violence if you were ever backed into a corner." Calvin swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat rolling down the side of his face. "We would never hurt our own daughter," Calvin stammered out, his voice cracking under the weight of his own lie. "We are a respectable family." Judge Sterling ignored his pathetic defense. She looked down at the parchment and began to read the final ironclad stipulation my grandfather had secretly embedded into the foundation of the trust. Should any blood relative attempt to bring physical harm to the primary heir or the mother of the heir, Judge Sterling read aloud, her voice booming with undeniable authority, "they shall be immediately and irrevocably stripped of all financial protections. Their lifelong executive pensions shall be permanently terminated without the possibility of appeal. Furthermore, all remaining family stock properties and liquid assets tied to their names shall be instantly seized and liquidated to a charity of Kiara choosing." The words hung in the air like an executioner blade. Yvonne stopped breathing completely. Calvin's jaw dropped open so wide he looked unhinged. They processed the legal terminology, realizing that my grandfather had installed a massive fatal tripwire designed to financially annihilate anyone who dared to lay a hand on me or my unborn child. Yvonne let out a frantic, breathless gasp. She shook her head violently, her eyes darting between me and the judge. "That does not apply to us," Yvonne shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. "We never hurt her. We never touched her. You cannot take our pensions away. That $10,000 a month is the absolute last thing we have left to survive. You cannot leave us with nothing." I sat back in my chair and rested both of my hands protectively over my pregnant stomach. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely no sympathy for the devastating ruin she had brought upon herself. "Do you have amnesia, Yvonne?" I asked, my voice deadly calm and perfectly leveled. "Do you not remember the Thanksgiving dinner just a few days ago? Do you not remember looking at my sonogram photo, screaming that the first grandchild must belong to Jasmine, and lunging across the dining table to attack me?" Yvonne's face drained of all remaining color. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. "That was a misunderstanding," Yvonne stuttered out frantically. "I slipped. I was emotional. I did not mean to strike you. You closed your fist and you violently punched the stomach of a pregnant woman." DeAndre intervened, his voice a low, lethal rumble that commanded the entire room. "You tried to murder my child to secure a payout for your golden daughter. And you did it in front of a dozen people. It is your word against mine," Yvonne screamed, pointing a shaking finger at DeAndre. "You cannot prove my intent. You cannot take my pension based on a family argument." Judge Sterling slammed her heavy wooden hands down onto the desk, silencing my mother instantly. "You seem to be forgetting a very crucial detail about that Thanksgiving dinner," Yvonne, Judge Sterling stated, her eyes narrowing into a glare of pure judicial disgust. "You seem to be forgetting exactly who walked through your dining room doors right after you physically assaulted the primary beneficiary of this $50 million trust." Calvin looked at the judge, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror as the realization finally crashed down on him. "I was standing right there," Judge Sterling declared, her voice ringing out like a death sentence. "I walked into your home, and I watched you strike your pregnant daughter with my own two eyes. I am the executor of this estate. I am a sitting federal judge. I am the absolute ultimate witness to your violent crime. Your assault was the exact trigger for this hidden clause." Yvonne collapsed back into her leather chair, her entire body going entirely limp. She let out a pathetic, suffocated whimper. As of this exact second, Judge Sterling announced, raising her pen to sign the execution order on the parchment, "Your $10,000 a month executive pensions are permanently revoked. Every single share of stock you hold in the family enterprise is officially liquidated. The funds are being redirected to a domestic abuse shelter under Kiara name. You have absolutely zero income. You have zero safety nets. You are legally, entirely, and irrevocably destitute." Calvin buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a loud, agonizing sob that echoed off the mahogany walls. The wealthy, arrogant patriarch was gone forever. Yvonne sat frozen, staring blankly at the polished wood table, her mind completely shattered by the absolute totality of her financial execution. They had nothing left to their names. I looked at my husband, who offered me a small, deeply satisfying smile of victory. We did not need to say another word to them. I stood up from my chair, smoothing my elegant maternity suit, ready to walk out of the judicial chamber and leave my parents to drown in the desolate, impoverished reality they had so aggressively earned. The true heir was safe. My grandfather's legacy was secure, and the toxic empire of my abusers was finally burned to the ground. The smoke cleared from the ashes of my parents' destroyed empire, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the justice system to deal with the rest of my abusers. 6 months later, I sat in the polished wooden gallery of a federal courtroom in downtown Atlanta. The heavy oak doors were sealed shut, and the air conditioning hummed with a sterile, freezing intensity. I wore a tailored navy blue blazer, my baby bump now proudly prominent. I sat next to DeAndre, watching the final act of this tragedy unfold before my eyes. Bradley was escorted into the courtroom by two massive armed federal marshals. The arrogant finance bro who once wore custom Italian suits and sneered at my existence was completely gone. In his place was a pathetic, trembling shell of a man. He wore a bright orange prison jumpsuit that swallowed his shrinking frame. His perfectly styled hair was thinning and greasy. His face was pale and sunken, hollowed out by the terrifying reality of federal detention. His wrists and ankles were bound in heavy steel chains that clanked loudly against the polished floor with every dragging step he took. Bradley looked desperately toward the gallery, searching for a lifeline. He locked eyes with his parents. The Vance family sat 2 rows ahead of me, radiating cold, generational wealth. They wore impeccable, conservative clothing, their faces locked in expressions of absolute disgust. They did not look like parents grieving the loss of a son. They looked like corporate board members evaluating a terrible investment. Bradley mouthed the word please to his father, begging for the elite legal defense team he had been promised. His father did not blink. The older man simply buttoned his suit jacket, stood up from the wooden bench, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. His mother followed immediately, abandoning their criminal son to the mercy of the federal government. A pathetic whimper escaped Bradley's throat as he realized he was completely alone. The federal judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for white-collar criminals, banged her gavel to call the room to order. She read the list of charges with a sharp, clipped tone: wire fraud, identity theft, federal bank forgery, embezzlement of charitable funds. The list went on and on, painting a comprehensive picture of a man who built his entire life on the stolen labor and equity of others. Bradley stood before the bench, crying openly, his tears falling onto the collar of his orange jumpsuit. You used your privilege and your connections to steal millions from vulnerable people and from your own family. The judge stated, her voice echoing through the massive room. You are not a victim of circumstance, Mr. Vance. You are a calculated predator. It is the sentence of this court that you serve 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The gavel slammed down like a thunderclap. Bradley's knees buckled completely. He collapsed against the defense table, wailing uncontrollably as the marshals grabbed him by the arms and dragged him backward through the heavy side doors. His screams faded into the concrete corridors of the courthouse, leaving a profound, satisfying silence in their wake. With Bradley locked away for the next decade and a half, the scales of justice turned their heavy gaze toward my sister. The golden child of Atlanta high society had suffered a spectacular, catastrophic fall from grace. The state attorney general had aggressively investigated Jasmine following my explosive press conference. They completely dismantled her fraudulent Women of Excellence Foundation, freezing every single asset and liquidating the remaining accounts to pay back the donors she had defrauded. The media tore her apart. Her face was plastered across every tabloid and news screen in the country, labeled as the ultimate scam artist. Jasmine managed to avoid a federal prison sentence only because she turned state evidence against her own husband, throwing Bradley entirely under the bus to save herself. But the judge did not let her walk away cleanly. She was stripped of all her remaining wealth. She was forced to declare total bankruptcy, moving out of her luxury townhouse and into a cramped, depressing studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. The court also mandated a brutal probation sentence, including 500 hours of strictly monitored manual community service. The scene of her punishment was the absolute pinnacle of poetic justice. I drove my Maybach to the downtown domestic abuse shelter, the exact same facility that was now massively funded by the liquidated pensions of my ruined parents. I parked across the street and watched through the tinted windows as a city bus pulled up to the curb. Jasmine stepped off the bus looking completely unrecognizable. She was not wearing diamonds or designer silk. She wore cheap faded denim jeans and a plain gray shirt. Her hair was tied back in a messy knot, and her face was devoid of the expensive makeup she once used to mask her ugly soul. She walked slowly toward the entrance of the shelter, her shoulders slumped in total defeat. Waiting for her at the front door was her assigned state parole officer, a massive, intimidating woman holding a heavy clipboard. The officer did not offer a friendly greeting. She pointed a stern finger toward a supply closet in the hallway. Jasmine walked inside and emerged a minute later holding a heavy industrial mop and a bright yellow plastic bucket filled with soapy water. I watched through the glass doors of the shelter as my sister dropped to her knees on the hard linoleum floor. The cruel, devastating irony of the moment was absolute. This was the exact same building where Jasmine used to host her glamorous fake charity events. This was the very hallway where she used to pose in $1,000 gowns, smiling for the cameras and pretending to care about the victims of abuse. Now she was nothing more than a disgraced bankrupt fraud ordered by the state to scrub the dirt off the floors she once walked on like a queen. The strict parole officer tapped her watch, demanding Jasmine work faster. My sister plunged the mop into the dirty water. A single tear escaped her eye as she began to scrub the scuffed linoleum. She was finally serving the very women she had exploited, and the empire of lies she had built was nothing but a painful, distant memory. While my sister was learning the harsh reality of manual labor under the fluorescent lights of the shelter, the architects of her entitlement were facing their own brutal descent into absolute poverty. The generational wealth that Yvonne and Calvin had ruthlessly hoarded the empire they had built on the broken backs of others was completely gone. In its place was a suffocating, inescapable nightmare. Atlanta can be an unforgiving city when you fall from the top. For my parents, the fall did not stop until they hit the absolute bottom. Without their sprawling mansion, without their luxury leased vehicles, and completely stripped of their $10,000 a month executive pensions, they had no safety net. Their wealthy friends abandoned them the second the federal indictments were unsealed. They were radioactive. No one at the Buckhead Pinnacle Country Club wanted to be associated with massive tax evasion and domestic assault. They were forced to relocate to a tiny rundown apartment complex on the very outskirts of the city, in a neighborhood they used to lock their car doors when driving through. The contrast was physically jarring. There were no vaulted ceilings or crystal chandeliers. Their new reality was a cramped one-bedroom box that smelled faintly of mildew and stale cigarette smoke. The walls were covered in peeling yellow wallpaper that curled at the edges like dead leaves. Yvonne sat at a cheap laminate kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall. The woman who used to spend her afternoons sipping imported champagne and critiquing floral arrangements was now a ghost of her former self. Her signature blonde hair, once perfectly maintained by elite stylists, was now showing thick roots of gray. Her acrylic nails had grown out chipped and broken, a glaring physical manifestation of her total bankruptcy. She wore a faded cotton robe, sweating in the oppressive Georgia heat, because the window air conditioning unit was broken and they could not afford to fix it. Yvonne did not cry anymore. The hysterical panic of the judicial chamber had burned itself out, leaving behind a hollow, catatonic depression. She spent hours just sitting in the sweltering heat, watching cockroaches scurry across the cracked linoleum floor, completely paralyzed by a life she did not know how to survive. She had never worked a day in her life. She had no marketable skills. She had nothing but the agonizing memories of a country club lifestyle that felt like a distant, unreachable dream. Calvin, on the other hand, was forced to face the public humiliation of manual labor just to keep the lights on. The former chief executive officer, a man who used to command boardrooms and intimidate corporate rivals, was now working for minimum wage. At 65 years old, Calvin had managed to secure a job at a discount grocery store 2 miles down the road. He was not a manager, he was a bagger. He wore a stiff, poorly fitted polyester uniform polo that scratched at his skin. For 8 hours a day, Calvin stood on his aching feet under harsh fluorescent lights, bagging canned goods and cheap produce for the exact demographic of people he had spent his entire life looking down upon. His arthritis flared violently, shooting sharp pain up his arms every time he lifted a heavy gallon of milk or pushed a line of metal shopping carts across the scorching asphalt parking lot. The psychological torment was worse than the physical pain. Customers would snap at him for bagging their items too slowly. Teenagers would toss crumpled dollar bills onto the counter, completely ignoring him. He had to swallow his pride, lower his head, and apologize endlessly just to keep his minimum wage paycheck. Every single day was a masterclass in total humiliation. The blistering afternoon sun beat down relentlessly as Calvin walked the 2 miles home from the grocery store. He could not afford a car, and the bus route did not align with his shift. He trudged along the cracked sidewalk, his shoulders hunched, carrying 2 thin plastic bags filled with off-brand cereal, discounted canned soup, and bruised fruit. Sweat poured down his weathered face, stinging his eyes. He looked like a broken, defeated old man, completely stripped of the arrogant armor he had worn his entire life. Calvin reached the rusted metal staircase of their apartment building. He paused at the bottom step, his chest heaving as he stared up at the second-floor walkway. Every step was a monumental effort. He gripped the wobbly iron handrails, slowly dragging his exhausted body and the cheap groceries up the stairs. I sat perfectly still in the plush, air-conditioned cabin of my chauffeur-driven Maybach, parked silently across the street from the decaying apartment complex. The tinted windows provided a perfect, undetectable vantage point. The luxurious leather seats cooled my back as I watched the scene unfold. I watched the man who had allowed my mother to steal my college fund struggle to carry a bag of cheap soup. I watched him pause on the landing, gasping for air, looking like the weight of the world was finally crushing him. I looked past him, catching a glimpse of Yvonne through the dirty apartment window, sitting motionless in the heat, trapped in her own personal hell. DeAndre sat beside me, reviewing a legal brief on his tablet. He glanced up, following my line of sight toward the rundown building. He did not say a word. He just waited, giving me the space to process whatever final emotion I needed to feel. But as I watched my parents suffer in the squalor they had built for themselves, I realized something profound. I did not feel angry. I did not feel the burning, vindictive triumph I thought I would. I did not feel pity or sadness. I felt an overwhelming, absolute emptiness. They were strangers to me. The people struggling up those rusted stairs were just 2 bitter, miserable strangers who had finally reaped the exact harvest they had sown. The emotional cord, frayed and damaged for 29 years, finally snapped completely. There was nothing left holding me to them. No lingering desire for their approval, no lingering trauma from their cruelty. Just pure, unadulterated apathy. The ultimate victory was not their destruction. The ultimate victory was my total indifference. I reached over and pressed a silver button on the door panel. The thick tinted glass of the Maybach window rolled up smoothly, completely sealing out the blistering heat, the noise of the traffic, and the sight of my ruined parents. I turned my attention away from the window and rested my hand on my pregnant stomach, feeling a strong, reassuring kick from the life growing inside me. "Take us home," I told the driver, my voice steady and entirely at peace. The massive luxury engine purred to life, and the Maybach pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the ghosts of my past behind forever. 3 months slipped by with the quiet grace of a storm finally breaking. For the first time in my 29 years of existence, I woke up every single morning without a tight knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach. The toxic weight of my blood relatives was completely gone. I did not check my phone expecting a demanding text from Yvonne or a manipulative guilt trip from Calvin. My sister was scrubbing floors in a shelter, and my brother-in-law was wearing federal orange behind bars. The silence they left behind was not empty or lonely. It was a beautiful, expansive canvas that DeAndre and I filled with genuine peace. We spent those 90 days preparing for the arrival of our son, not as a pawn in a twisted family chess match, but as a deeply desired child. The nursery in our secured estate was painted in soft, warm tones, far away from the cold, calculating aesthetics of my parents' foreclosed mansion. I spent my afternoons organizing tiny clothes and reading books completely entirely free from the suffocating shadows of my past. When the contractions finally started on a crisp Tuesday morning, there was no panic. There was no chaotic rush, no screaming, and absolutely no performative drama. DeAndre simply closed his laptop, kissed my forehead, and drove us to the most exclusive state-of-the-art maternity hospital in Atlanta. The birthing suite looked more like a luxury penthouse than a medical facility. Sunlight streamed through massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lush green canopy of the city. Soft ambient music played from hidden speakers, and the faint scent of lavender diffused through the crisp air, purifying the space. I lay in the pristine adjustable bed, gripping my husband's hand as another massive wave of pain washed over me. DeAndre did not flinch or look away. He leaned in close, his dark eyes locked onto mine, anchoring me entirely to the present moment. He wiped the sweat from my brow with a cool, damp cloth, whispering words of absolute devotion. "You are doing so beautifully, Kiara," he murmured, his voice a steady grounding force in the quiet room. "I am right here with you. We are doing this together." For the first time in my life, I felt completely protected. I was not a human shield for someone else. I was the center of a circle of unbreakable love. Outside the heavy soundproof doors of our suite, the waiting room was a testament to the beautiful life I had built with my own two hands. There was no toxic family infighting playing out in the corridors. There were no cameras, no fake tears, and no reporters looking for a juicy socialite scandal. Instead, the room was filled with my chosen family. DeAndre's parents sat together, holding hands, radiating the warm, unconditional acceptance that my own mother and father had always brutally denied me. They had embraced me from the very first day, treating me like a cherished daughter simply because I loved their son. Sitting across from them were the senior partners from my forensic accounting firm, the brilliant, fiercely loyal colleagues who had helped me dismantle the fraudulent empire of my abusers. They brought flowers and quiet excitement, respecting the sanctity of the moment. And sitting quietly in the corner, observing the joyful anticipation with a soft, rare smile, was Judge Sterling. She was no longer just the rigid executor of my grandfather's estate. She had become a trusted mentor, a guardian of the truth who stayed to ensure the transition of power was absolute. They were all waiting patiently to welcome a child who would never have to fight for his basic right to exist. The medical monitors beeped in a steady, rhythmic cadence as the final stages of labor approached. The physical pain intensified, becoming a sharp, all-consuming fire that radiated through my entire core, but I pushed through it, fueled by the sheer determination to finally meet the life I had fought so fiercely to protect. DeAndre held my shoulders, his own face tight with empathetic focus, as the attending physician, a top specialist in the state, gave the final instructions. One more massive push, Kiara, the doctor encouraged, her voice, calm, authoritative, and deeply reassuring. "You are almost there. The finish line is right here." I squeezed my eyes shut, tightening my grip on DeAndre's hand, until my knuckles turned bright white. I drew in a massive breath, filling my lungs completely, and pushed with every remaining ounce of strength in my exhausted, trembling body. I poured all the survival instincts, all the resilience, and all the fierce, protective, motherly love into that single defining moment. And then the room was suddenly filled with a sound that shattered the quiet tension. It was a loud, healthy, piercing cry. The beautiful, undeniable sound of absolute victory. The heavy burden of my past completely evaporated as that cry echoed off the walls of the luxury suite. "He is here!" DeAndre choked out, hot tears streaming down his strong face as he pressed his lips to the side of my head. "We have a son, Kiara. We did it." The nurses moved with practiced efficiency, cleaning the screaming infant before wrapping him snugly in a soft white hospital blanket. The doctor stepped forward, her eyes shining with professional pride, and gently placed my newborn baby directly onto my bare chest. The exact moment his warm, fragile weight settled against my skin, the entire universe shifted on its axis. His tiny fists curled tightly against my collarbone, and his frantic cries slowly quieted as he listened to the familiar, steady rhythm of my racing heart. I looked down at his beautiful, perfect face, his chest rising and falling with healthy breaths, and a wave of pure, unadulterated joy washed over my entire soul. The generational curse was officially broken forever. I brushed a gentle, reverent kiss against his warm forehead, making a silent, unbreakable vow to the universe. "You will never know the cold, conditional love that I grew up with," I whispered, my voice thick with raw emotion. "You will never be used as a financial pawn or cast aside as a convenient scapegoat. You will only ever know warmth, security, and absolute safety." He was the sole inheritor of a $50 million empire, the undisputed true heir to my grandfather's legacy. He would never want for anything material in his entire life. But as I held him tightly in my arms with my loving, brilliant husband, weeping tears of joy beside me, I knew the trust fund was the least important thing he inherited today. More importantly, he was truly, fiercely, and unconditionally loved. 6 months later, the crisp autumn wind swept through the towering oak trees of Buckhead, carrying away the final lingering remnants of the scorching summer. I stood on the sprawling wrap-around balcony of our massive estate, holding my healthy 6-month-old son resting against my hip. He let out a joyful, bright laugh, reaching his chubby hands toward the falling golden leaves. I buried my face in his soft curls, inhaling the sweet, pure scent of a child who only knew absolute peace. The morning sun cast a warm, brilliant glow over the manicured lawns and the long, sweeping driveway, but the true beauty of this moment was not the landscape. It was the absolute poetic justice of the ground I was standing on. This was not just any luxury estate. This was the exact same property where I had spent 29 years suffocating under the weight of emotional abuse. When the bank finalized the foreclosure on Calvin and Yvonne Adams, I did not just let the mansion go to a random buyer. My forensic accounting firm purchased the deed directly from the financial institution in a completely anonymous, all-cash transaction. The moment the keys were legally in my hand, I hired the most ruthless demolition and architecture firm in the state. I did not want to live in their shadows, so I completely erased them. We gutted the entire property down to the absolute studs. We completely eradicated the dark, oppressive dining room where the Thanksgiving massacre occurred. We tore out the cramped side kitchen where Yvonne used to force me to eat cold leftovers, while Jasmine dined on expensive catered meals. In their place, we constructed a massive open-concept living space flooded with natural sunlight. The sprawling double staircase where my sister used to pose for her fake charity photo shoots was violently demolished and replaced with sleek, floating glass steps. We ripped out the mahogany walls and the gaudy crystal chandeliers that my mother had worshipped. The suffocating, heavy energy of my childhood was eradicated, replaced entirely by fresh air, open spaces, and the echoing laughter of my chosen family. The house was no longer a monument to fake generational wealth. It was a fortress of genuine love. The heavy sliding glass door behind me glided open on its silent tracks. DeAndre stepped out onto the balcony wearing a comfortable tailored sweater, his strong presence immediately warming the crisp morning air. He stepped up directly behind me, wrapping his thick, muscular arms securely around my waist and pulling my back flush against his chest. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the side of my neck before resting his chin on my shoulder. He looked down at our smiling son, and then out over the sprawling green estate that we now proudly owned, free and clear. You built an empire, Kiara, DeAndre murmured, his deep voice rumbling against my back in a soothing, familiar rhythm. You tore down their lies and you built a perfect kingdom right on top of the ruins. I leaned back into his solid embrace, feeling an overwhelming, profound sense of victory. I did not have to fight anymore. The war was completely over and the good guys had actually won. My gaze drifted slowly past the manicured hedges and the sprawling front lawn, coming to rest on the massive wrought iron security gates that protected the perimeter of the property. The gates were newly installed, towering black iron spikes that physically separated our sanctuary from the rest of the world. And standing on the public sidewalk, just inches from those impenetrable bars, was a solitary, fragile figure. I stiffened slightly, my eyes locking onto the woman standing in the autumn cold. It was Yvonne. She was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant socialite who used to rule this exact driveway. The expensive designer coats and flawless salon blowouts were gone forever. She wore a thin, cheap gray cardigan that offered zero protection against the biting Georgia wind. Her hair was a messy, untamed knot of wiry gray strands. Her posture was entirely broken, her shoulders slumped heavily under the crushing permanent weight of absolute poverty. She was wearing a pair of scuffed, cheap sneakers that were slowly falling apart at the seams. A faded canvas grocery bag hung loosely from her bony shoulder. The physical toll of living in a roach-infested, sweltering apartment had aged her 10 years in the span of 6 months. I knew from my investigative team that Calvin had recently abandoned her, moving into a cheap boarding house closer to his grocery store job because he could no longer stand listening to her catatonic silence. She was entirely alone. Yvonne stood on the cracked concrete of the public sidewalk, gripping the cold iron bars of the gate with her bare, trembling hands. She was staring up at the massive glass windows of the newly renovated mansion. She was looking for a glimpse of the life she threw away. She was desperately hoping for a glance from the daughter she had abused, marginalized, and tried to destroy. She had nothing left. No husband, no golden child, no money, and no home. The crushing isolation had finally driven her back to the only place she ever felt powerful. DeAndre noticed my shift in posture. He followed my line of sight, spotting the ragged woman shivering outside the gates. His arms tightened around me instinctively, a silent promise of absolute protection. "Should I call estate security?" DeAndre asked quietly, his voice hardening with cold authority. "I can have the local police remove her for trespassing in 5 minutes." I shook my head slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the pathetic figure at the gate. "No," I whispered calmly, holding my son a little closer to my chest. "Let her look. Let her see exactly what she lost." As if she could hear my words across the vast expanse of the front lawn, Yvonne slowly tilted her head upward. Her hollow, sunken eyes scanned the second-story balcony, and then she saw me. For a fraction of a second, time completely froze. Across the sprawling manicured grass and the towering iron gates, my eyes locked directly onto the eyes of my mother. I saw the desperate, agonizing realization crash over her face. She saw me standing in the heart of her former empire, surrounded by absolute luxury, wrapped in the arms of a fiercely protective husband, and holding the $50 million heir she had tried so violently to terminate. She saw that I had completely and permanently replaced her. Yvonne's lips parted as if she wanted to scream or beg or apologize. Her trembling hand reached out through the iron bars, a pathetic, desperate plea for a connection that had been severed permanently. I did not smile. I did not frown. I did not feel a single drop of anger, sadness, or pity. My expression was utterly, undeniably cold. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, and I saw absolutely nothing but a stranger standing in the street. I held my son tightly, turning my back on Yvonne in the bitter autumn wind. I walked back inside the beautiful, warm sanctuary of my home, with DeAndre right beside me. I reached out and pulled the heavy glass door shut, hearing the satisfying mechanical click of the automatic titanium lock sliding firmly into place. The glass sealed tight, shutting my mother out in the freezing cold forever. The story teaches that walking away from toxic family members is not a sign of weakness, but the ultimate declaration of strength. True wealth is never found in inheritances, country clubs, or designer clothes, but rather in the absolute peace you fiercely protect and the loyal chosen family you build. Forgiveness is not a mandatory obligation when it requires sacrificing your own happiness. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply living a successful, joyful life, completely indifferent to those who once tried to destroy you. Subscribe and share your personal story in the comments below to inspire others watching today.